Hi guys, today we're going to look at descent management in the 737. This is the PMDG 737-800 for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. So we're flying down to Alicante from East Midlands. We're in the cruise, we've done our briefing, we've set the aircraft up, we've done the descent checklist, so we've set the auto brake, set our minima, set our courses for the RMP approach, and yeah, we're ready to descend. So as you can see, we're approaching the top of descent point. That's calculated by VNAV, so in 4 miles the aircraft wants to start descending, and that's worked out by the figures that we've entered in the descent page along with the descent winds that we entered earlier. It doesn't always necessarily go exactly to plan like that. There might be crossing traffic or something like that, which means that air traffic won't give you a descent immediately. So if we continue with the simulation now, we first get the message in the scratch pad from the FMC that says reset MCP altitude. So you'd be calling for descent, perhaps 10 miles to go, you'd call air traffic, ProFlight 12 requesting descent, and they hopefully would give you descent, but for today we'll simulate being left slightly high. So we're expecting this to get to the top of descent point, then our FMA, which is our flight mode annunciator in pitch, to change to alt hold. Let's spin the heading bug around this way. VNAV alt, in fact. Depends on the fit of the aircraft, some are slightly different to others. Okay, again it's telling us to reset MCP altitude. And now this is quite useful. This is showing us getting high on the profile. So if you imagine that magenta diamond there is the profile, and the middle of this white line here is our aeroplane. So we're sat above the profile by getting on for 600 feet. So what can we do? The speed's bleeding off at the moment, so we definitely wouldn't allow that. With speed intervene, change over because we want to be on a Mach number, keep it at 7.5 as a minimum, just to give us a bit of margin. You want 10 to 15 knots margin above this minimum manoeuvre speed here. So yeah, you'd be looking at this thinking, well, this isn't ideal, but there's not a great deal we can do about it. Again, make sure you've got plenty of margin up here. We'd expect the auto throttle to be responding a bit quicker than that. But there we are, it's doing something about it now. Okay, I think that's high enough. So now we're above the profile, as we've mentioned. We'll simulate air traffic giving us a descent now. There are several ways you can do this. Let's say that they've cleared us down to flight level 210. My preferred method in this case is to hit level change, and if we look in the descent page, our descent path is predicated by initially descending at 0.64 and then converting to 250 knots. So if we fly slightly faster, as you can imagine, the aircraft wants to pitch down more to maintain that speed, because the way the jet wants to descend is with the thrust levers are idle, and down we go. So we can keep the speed up. I'd probably stick to 7.8 to begin with. You want to be aware of overspeeding the aeroplane, keeping a good lookout out the window. There's nothing on TCAS either. There is a bit of weather out there, but that's slightly lower down, so we won't need the engine anti-ice on at the moment. And because we're increasing that speed, you don't necessarily need the speed brake this early on in the descent. Obviously, if air traffic give you a speed restriction, that's a slightly different kettle of fish, but at the moment we're happy enough to descend slightly quicker than we initially anticipated, so we'll speed up a touch more. So in this case, if we were this high, I'd probably be looking to speed all the way up to about 300 knots. Kind of just sees how it, you kind of just have to see how it pans out with regards to your vertical profile. As you can see, we're catching it up. That's fairly blurry, but it is reducing. We've got a decent rate of descent on. Make sure that the cabin's keeping up. It does a pretty good job on this machine. You'd expect that to be descending slightly, about 200 feet a minute you'd expect. Down she goes. See, we've almost caught it up now, but we're slightly quick. So I'd probably stop this at 290 knots. So as you descend at a constant Mach number, your indicated airspeed is always increasing. So waiting for it to get up there. That's close enough. Change over, set 290, still got a bit of margin there. It's going to dive slightly more. Okay, so this is it seems to work on every Boeing. I've flown the 7.5, the 777 and the 7.3. So for every 10 knots that you are above this descent speed, you want to be 300 feet below the path. So we're 290 knots, 40 knots quicker than the VNAV path. You basically want to be 1,200 feet below the path. So we can speed up a touch more, which would mean when I want to be 1,500 feet below, because we're 50 knots faster. So 50 times 30 is 1,500. So we're waiting for this to say 1,500. And we've still got 8,000 feet to go, so I'm sure that's going to come in. Do we need the engine anti-ice? Yep. So engine anti-ice on would be your call. So the engine start switches go to continuous, engine anti-ice goes to on, check that those go bright and then dim so they're in the commanded position, and the thermal anti-ice is indicated above the M1s. Okay, so coming down, waiting for 1,500 feet on here. Doesn't seem to be catching it up quite as quickly as it would for real, but we're getting there. You could give it a bit of speed brake. The other thing to be aware of is you don't have the protections that VNAV allows. In level change, it's literally just saying, okay, you want to descend at 300 knots, and it pushes the nose down until it maintains 300 knots with the thrust levers at idle. So, like in this case, say this was higher, say this was 250 or above, you need to be aware of that during your descent, but this is just a cleaner way of us intercepting the path at a decent speed. Okay, that's close enough. We'll bring the speed back now to 250. And then we'll see it pitch up, the rate of descent reduce. It doesn't level off for real usually. It should start to come back in now. And then as soon as this path is within 100 feet or so of where we want to be, I'll hit VNAV, it'll bug 250 and it'll follow the path at 250 knots. Because the other way you can do this is you could, instead of going into level change, you could just speed intervene and wind the speed up in VNAV. But the problem with that is you then intercept the VNAV path at a speed much quicker than you want to be doing. It'll capture the path from above at whatever speed you've got bugged in there, but it'll still have the path that's drawn in the descent page in the FMC. Okay, so the speed's coming back nicely, we're pretty much on profile. So we go back into VNAV, VNAV path's engaged, and now it'll follow the path at 250 knots. And the key thing is, these have been closed the whole time. It's been comfortable for the passengers because you've not used the speed brake. Okay, so that's kind of one eventuality. Let's use a weather radar. That looks a bit fruity there. See if that's painting anything. It looks okay. Cool. So yeah, so that's one thing that air traffic can give you, giving you a late descent clearance like that. Another thing, if you're bunched up behind some more traffic, they could slow you down, so they could ask you to do 220 knots, for example. There are a few ways of doing that. The best way to do it, in my opinion, if you want to slow down to any speed above min clean, just put it in the descent page. So the other option, we could hit level change, 220 knots, but then all the data that's this path is given us is inaccurate, because this is predicated on a 250 knot descent. You could also, as I mentioned before, speed intervene, set 220 knots in there, but again, all that's going to do is it's going to follow a 250 knot descent path, and it's going to try and do it at 220 knots, so you'll end up with a speed brake out the whole way down, which is just not going to work. So the best way to do it is give it some more accurate information, put 220 in there, then it's going to fly a slightly shallower path, and it's going to need you to give it some help to begin with. So it's bug 220. We're pretty much on profile, but we're too fast, so we're going to pull speed brake to the flight detent. Cool. It's gone into FMC speed. Always call the FMAs as they change. It's good to be aware of which FMAs you've got. And it just happens that later on in the approach we've got a 220 knot restriction as well. Okay, so that's pretty much that. Let's say they're descending us to an altitude now, so pro flight 12, descend altitude 8,000 feet. Let's call it 6,000 feet in actual fact. So set 6,000, get your FO to check that, make sure you've set it correctly, and then because we're descending to an altitude, not a flight level, you need to set QNH. So QNH is cross-checked, and then we can do the approach checklist. And we still need to remember the speed brake's out as well. So it's saying we're 800 feet low. Whenever you've got the speed brake out, keep your hand on it, and then you'll remember to put it away. There you go. Okay, so it's slightly low. It's going to put thrust on now, and it'll descend at 1,000 feet a minute until we capture that path. So we'd set QNH. We've done the descent checklist already. Altimeters are set. The approach checklist is complete. Still got the anti-ice on. The temperature still needs the anti-ice on. Okay, so what else can we demonstrate? We've done 220 knots there. Another thing we could demo would be they start sending you off on vectors, so you're no longer following the LNAV track. Again, that could be due to traffic. So say they give you heading 150 for sequencing. I tend to leave it in VNAV when we're within sort of 5 to 10 miles of the LNAV track, because you know it's there or thereabouts. But if you start getting vectored off something like this, you need to be aware of the MSA, and can they vector you down to 6,000 feet. In this part of the world there is a bit of high ground around Alicante, so you'd look on your charts, make sure that that's safe and you're happy with that to begin with. And then I'd be thinking, well, we don't want to be descending much more than that. So I go into VS, because we're not following, we've got increased track mileage, so we've got further to fly before we're going to land, so we don't want to get too low. We can fly at 500 feet a minute down. It's gone into MCP speed. That's the thrust mode, that's the roll mode, that's the pitch mode, so we're in MCP speed and vertical speed. And I'll probably just stick with that. They wanted us at 220 knots, that's fair enough. And that tries to, or gives us a fighting chance of flying a continuous descent approach. Okay, so that's enough of that. Say now they want direct to Bezor. Okay, get your FO to check that once you've brought it to the top of the legs page. Go into LNAV, again check your FMAs, make sure they're engaged. And we will say that they've got their planning slightly wrong. Now they want you to speed up, they want 280 knots. Stick that in there. Okay, how's that looking? Pretty much there. Set to 80, it's going to stick some thrust on. Go into level change for the time being, because you know it's going to behave. Retard at MCP speed, which is what you would expect. And now it's going to pitch down. So I would anticipate us getting slightly lower than the path. If you imagine it's taking thrust off, it's pitching down to gain that 280 knots. It's not on a continuous 280 knot descent. So I would imagine we probably need, at this stage, we could go into VNAV. The way the VNAV logic works, if you're below the profile, yes, it'll give you the speed, but it'll also just give you 1,000 feet a minute down until you capture that path again. So it's gone into speed and path. I'd expect this to pitch up and give you an appropriate amount of thrust to maintain 1,000 feet a minute down. Okay, that's quite sporting. I'll come back down again. That's going to say 1,000 or thereabouts, yeah. And then we're going to capture this back up. Again, as I said earlier, you imagine that magenta bug as the path that the FMC's drawn, a perfect 280 knot path. And then the middle of this white line is the aeroplane. So the aeroplane is below the path at the moment. Cool beans. Okay, so this is an RMP approach. The way they would tend to let you fly this would be to leave you to your own devices. So I would imagine the speed brake's armed. It wouldn't normally be armed at this stage, it would be down. Make sure that's down. Yep. Yeah, so what else have we got on here? It's doing a cracking job in VNav. As I said, 1,000 feet a minute. The path's coming in. We're expecting it to go into retard in a moment. And then you can see these discs here. That's indicating deceleration. So it's got the speed restriction, 240 knots at flight level 100. So we're doing 280. It thinks that we should start slowing down to 240 knots at that point there. So when we pass flight level 100, we'll be doing 240. And then later on in the approach, it's got more descent points for that 220 knots at Bezor. So in an ideal world, if this was behaving, you just leave it to its own devices. So let's see, retard, which is what we expected from the FMA. There's the aircraft, there's the path. We're on the path at the speed that's in the descent page. Again, keep this updated, make sure that's accurate. And down she goes. Enjoying all this time. Obviously, you're keeping an eye out at the weather, making sure you're safe in terms of terrain, looking at the clock, looking at your fuel. So we're expecting to be landing in 14 minutes. Most airlines put the seatbelt signs on at 20 minutes, so we would have called for that. Get your ATIS at some stage, make sure your landing performance is up to date. I don't know why that's indicating fuel use, that should be a temporary thing. Cool. Yeah, so there's not a great deal else we can demo really. I'll show you how this works in VNav. The key is keeping the data updated, so your LNAV's accurate, your VNAV's accurate, and you know where you are in space, and what you're trying to achieve is a constant descent approach, keeping these closed for as long as possible. So in an ideal world, you get to your top of descent point at 38,000 feet, whatever it is, these close, it goes into retard and path, and then you fly down the entire descent, idle thrust, and then by 1,000 feet above the runway, when you've got the gear down and you're landing flap, then the thrust comes back up to stabilise the approach. In an ideal world, which is easier said than done with other traffic and weather and air traffic control. So yeah, we're getting there. We're expecting that speed to start reducing in a minute. And at this stage, you'd be looking at this high ground. You'd be checking your charts. Dismiss that. So we're on the Valencia arrival, 1-2-8. Flight level 80 is the minimum. So they wouldn't have cleared us to 6, I wouldn't have thought by this stage. Let's have a look if there's an MRC chart. Radar minimum altitudes, these charts are useful. So under radar control, and you could tune the ALT VOR and work out how far you are. I think it might be based on the airfield in actual fact, so you can stick that in the fixed page. A lot of the AFBs these days plot your position on the charts as well. In here, so we're on the 024 radial at 30 miles, so we're between that 20 mile point, that 40 mile point, so they're happy to descend you down to 7,000 at that stage. So 6,000 is a bit ambitious, we'll stick 7 in there. So the auto throttle's gone into arm, which means we can manipulate that ourselves at this point. So if the speed started to get low, it's going to prioritise the path, and say your descent winds aren't quite accurate or whatever it might be, you can give it a bit more thrust or take thrust off. They're usually idle at this stage. Again, looking out the window, we're clear of the weather at the moment, so we can do ourselves a favour by turning the engine anti-ice off. Again, bright and then dim to show that it's in the commanded position. And these can go back to off, not that way. Looking at the clock, we've got 12 minutes to go, so I'd probably give the cabin crew 10 minutes to landing. And speed's bleeded off, as we mentioned earlier, or bled off I should say, and then we've got another decel point here, so we're expecting to get to that decel point, and it's going to decelerate to 220 knots as per the legs page I should say. there isn't a great deal else to demo. I suppose what they could do is give you a shortcut. So once you're out over the sea, they might give you direct to the Alpha 10 Echo, Alpha Lima 10 Echo, something like that, which would reduce your track mileage. And there are 3 ways in an airliner to get down quicker, increase your drag. I suppose there are 4 ways. So the first one would be to increase the speed, and then there are 3 ways to increase drag. You can extend the speed brake, extend the flaps, or put the gear down. So you tend to want to do those in that order. The only thing with this aeroplane is below 250 knots the speed brake isn't particularly effective, so I tend to bring the speed back and then get some flap out, and it descends really well. Especially if you're happy to accept an increased rate of descent, especially if you're over the sea, as we're going to be in a minute. You know, that's not going to cause you any issues with regards to terrain. Beautiful day. Somebody's left their pens there, not mine. Okay, right. So that'll do for that. It's getting pretty boring now. Let's go to, let's say they ask you to go direct. Obviously you don't have to accept the direct if you think you're not going to have enough track miles, but that would give you a modified track mileage there. That's saying 27, and again with your 3 times table, 27. 8 times 3 is 24, plus a bit for the speed. I'd suggest that's sensible. That's saying we're high. Again, the secret weapon is level change. They want us at 220. I'd ask them if we could increase the speed, but what you've got to bear in mind is you don't want to be going too fast at this stage. So I'd then extend some flaps. So speed limit's 250 knots. It's good to know these flat placard limits. 250 knots for flaps 1, 2 and 5. 210 knots for flaps 10. 200 knots for flap 15. 25 is 190 knots, and then 175 for flap 30 and 162 for flap 40. As I bring the heading bug round, requesting further descent, set something like 3,000. We can have a look again. As you can see, things start to move pretty quickly, so it's handy if you've got these out. So you would expect direct to this point here, they'd probably descend you down to 2.5, let's call it 3 will work. So we've got flap 5 out, we've still got the speed high, but we're starting to catch the path up. And this banana here is predicting that we're going to level off at 3,000 feet before that point there, so that's looking sensible. Again, keeping our eye on these, making sure these look sensible. So the height's coming off nicely. The legs page wants us to be 200 knots by there. So I'd keep letting it get the height off. Again, we've not had to use the speed brake yet. Not that it's the absolute enemy, because it's not, but it's just not particularly effective below 250 knots. Okay, so that's there or thereabouts. Start bringing the speed back now. 12 flap 5 manoeuvre speed, 170 knots to begin with. Should do it nicely. So you can have a look up here. Should let that really. So from 2,500 feet, the 10 Echo is 10.3 miles. So let's call that the platform altitude now. And then I would stick that in the fixed page, the 2 mile ring around it. And then once we get to that ring, we can set our MDA. So it's all going to happen at once. Again, it's looking a bit high there. So you can push the speed up. 190 knots is perfectly fine. Keeping an eye on the wind, there's only 12 knots of wind up here, so our ground speed's not particularly high. I think this is going to work out nicely. Again, let's push the nose down, we've got a bit of extra drag out, just giving us a nice rate of descent. Ground speed is 190 knots. Okay, what was the legs page? 200 knots it wants here, so yeah, we're about there, aren't we? We'll be a bit more conservative with it. Come back to 170. Right, so we want to be, we've got LNAV, we've got the MDA to begin with. We can go into VNAV now, speed into VN, 170. So for RMP approaches, the acronym LAVs is pretty useful. So it's LNAV, make sure your altitude window is set to something sensible, VNAV's engaged in the modes that you want it to be in, and speed intervene. So we're approaching, okay, I didn't put the speed in earlier on, we'll go for that now. It's in path, less than 1,000 feet to go. We're approaching our glide path, so then we can wind down. We've got 550 as the minimum, so I'd set 600 in here. And now it should do its thing as we come around the corner. And after the 10 echo, we're expecting it to start a descent towards the runway. What's our distance to go? 11 miles. So we're doing 170 knots at 11 miles. That's cushy. Around the corner. Are we visual? It's looking pretty good. Okay, we're expecting it. The path's coming in approach mode. We're expecting it to start a descent. Beautiful. 10 miles. Okay. And what was the missed approach altitude? 4,000. So at least 300 feet below the missed approach altitude, so I'd wind that back up to 4,000. I'll start to configure now. I still expect it to descend. So we'll go gear down, give it some more flap. 10, flap 15, that's the flap 15 manoeuvre speed. A couple of other things we have to do at that point. Set these to continuous and chime the cabin crew to let them know we're about to land. That should be on as well at this stage. And our VREF for flap 30 was 140. So we've set flap 30, not much wind, so we'll go for an extra 5 knots on the VREF. Okay, so then you're looking for 5 greens. You want the speed brake armed as well when you put the gear down. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the flaps set where you want them. Now we're visual. Then you're going to call for the landing checklists, which is challenge and response. So your FO would say engine start switches, you would say continuous, speed brake, you would say armed, landing gear down, some airlines say 3 greens, and the flaps 30 green light, landing check is complete, and then make sure you've got landing clearance. Okay, so this is the point at which in the approach most airlines want you to be stable, so they want the gear to be down and the landing flap to be set. So there's 1,000 feet. Make sure you've got your missed approach altitude set, and that's pretty much it for this one. Hope that was of some use. If it wasn't, let me know what to cover in the other videos, and yeah, thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Cheers.